taking the time out of your day today, and I know this is lunchtime, so feel free to eat if you have food with you. I know that this is a valuable time, so we really appreciate you taking the time to be here for this training, and we'll make it worth your while, give you some good information. A couple sort of housekeeping notes. Folks on the phone, we do have everybody on mute for now, and then we will unmute at the end, and there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. So if you have questions as we go through the slides, just make note of them so you can ask those at the end. It's easier than trying to unmute and mute as we go, and then there's no feedback and background noise. And then also for everyone, just be aware we're actually going to be videotaping this session so that if folks sign up to volunteer after today, they'll have access to it. So just know that. I don't think the camera can see any of you in the room. It's pointed at me. But just be aware that that's going on. So today you're all here for the Citizenship Day 2014-2015 volunteer training. This is a training for Citizenship Day on October 18th. So the fact that you're here means that you're signed up to volunteer with us, which is huge. We really, really appreciate all of you. Just a little overview about what I'm going to cover today, and with my attorney trainer here, Greg. So I will be going over sort of Citizenship Day, what it is, what to expect, logistics, and expectations for volunteers. Greg will be going over the legal requirements for citizenship, which includes sort of the basic legal eligibility requirements, and then also red flags, who should not apply, how to kind of screen out those potential issues. And then we'll be doing an in-depth look at how to complete the N400 form. So those of you on the phone, you'll want to make sure that you pulled up the PDF of the N400 form or printed it out that we sent out ahead of time, and then we have those printed here, so make sure you have one. And we'll also be talking about how to complete the application for a fee waiver, which is the I-912 form as well. So that's kind of the general overview. Should have you out of here by 1:30. Fingers crossed. So a little background about Citizenship Day. First of all, my name is Lily Hankins. I'm the program manager of Washington New Americans, which is a program of One America, a statewide immigrant rights organization. And Washington New Americans, the program itself, exists to help expand access to citizenship for people in Washington state. There are an estimated 180,000 legal permanent residents all across the state that are green card holders, have had their green card for long enough to meet the eligibility requirements to apply for citizenship, but in a given year, less than 10% of those people actually do so due to a number of barriers, one of which is the complexity of the process, the application form, the cost of getting good legal advice, and then the application fee cost. So we'll be talking about all that stuff today, but what my program at One America exists to do is to try to connect people to services all across the state to help them overcome those barriers. And one key signature event is Citizenship Day, which you're all signed up to help out with. So Citizenship Day is a day-long free legal clinic for people who want to apply for citizenship. It was actually founded by the Washington State chapter of AILA, the American Immigration Lawyers Association. They started doing them back in 2004, 2005, and then One America started taking over sort of the logistics back in 2008. But AILA Washington is still one of our key partners for this event. AILA volunteers, we have many AILA members who volunteer at multiple different citizenship days every year. And we really appreciate all of their help. They started it, and then the AILA chapters all across the country started replicating it. So now there are citizenship days run by AILA chapters in states all across the country, thanks to the Washington chapter. So since 2008, just at Citizenship Day alone, almost 4,000 people have received help applying for citizenship. So it's one of the only free services still around. Even a lot of nonprofits that provide citizenship help, depending on the funding that they get, have to charge nominal fees in order to be able to keep their programs running. So for some people, even that can be a barrier. Here's some photos from previous events. A couple things to cover around why we want to make sure that people who want to apply for US citizenship can do so. The first, number one benefit of US citizenship is the right to vote. But there are a number of other benefits that come with the transition from a legal permanent resident to a naturalized US citizen. being able to apply for government jobs, public employment, running for office. Certain public benefits and scholarships are more available for citizens than they are for non-citizens. Freedom from deportation, regardless of crimes committed or any other things that come up. If you're a US citizen, you can't be deported. You're able to travel more easily, and people can stay out of the country without restrictions on how long they can stay out of the country, which is not true for legal permanent residents. You can help petition for family members to come into the country, and a lot of the wait times are less for visa petitions if you're a US citizen compared to being a permanent resident. And then if you become a citizen and you have children that are permanent residents that are under 18, they can become citizens automatically as well, and we'll cover that a little bit later.
Joining the meeting.
So we are on slide number 5. I'll try to remember for folks on the phone what slide we're on. So talking a little bit about what to expect on Citizenship Day, the next one being October 18th, where you're all signed up to help out. We do ask that all volunteers plan to arrive at 8 a.m. We know that's an early morning, so we'll be providing plenty of coffee, caffeine, and breakfast, all provided for you. So we want to make sure you get there by then so that you can get some breakfast, get settled in, get to know the site, and then we'll be providing a training specific to your site. So some of the details that we may not be able to cover in this general training for all volunteers, we'll be covering that morning about, where do you need to go for this, where's the copy machine, who are the attorneys on site, who are your go-to people for questions. All that good stuff is things that we cover starting at 8 a.m. We open our doors to the public at 10. Depending on the site and how busy it is, we're expecting that many of our sites will probably have a line prior to that. And so just be aware of that. Be aware that our sites tend to be pretty busy, and if we're all of us as volunteers and us as staff people aware of that and communicating with people as they're coming in about wait times and how we're going to help them today, then it goes really smoothly. But sometimes volunteers have been like, oh my gosh, there's a line, I just got here at 8 and what's going on? So that's pretty normal. This is a big deal for people, and they're planning to be there for most of the day. So we close the doors, stop taking new clients at 3, or when we reach our sort of maximum number, which is a determination that your site teams make. But you should expect to stay until around 5 to finish up with the folks that we've taken in until 3. And then just a note about, it's important to be flexible. I mean, if you've volunteered at Citizenship Day before, you know this already, but it tends to be a little bit of a controlled chaos environment. There's a system in place, it's all under control, but it can be a little bit hectic sometimes, especially right at the beginning when there's a lot of people coming in the doors. So sometimes we may ask you, maybe signed up for a specific role, but we may ask you to help out doing something else for a little while. So if you can just kind of be flexible with us with that, and if you have any restrictions on what you can do, just make sure you let us know. But if you're signed up for an interpreter, but we need somebody to go get more paper for the copier from over here, and we ask you to do that, that's just because we need all of us as a team to work together to make this work. So it's a really fun day. It goes by super fast, but just kind of a note about flexibility and expect a little bit of hectic fun. For those of you who are volunteering, a couple notes just about basic etiquette and responsibilities. One thing to note is that all of these people are, people with complicated stories. They're human beings. They will be sharing a lot of information, and as you'll see when we get into the N400 form, it asks for a lot of really private details about people's lives, and they're sharing that so we can do these applications with them. So it's important that we're all kind of taking the time to establish rapport with everyone that we're working with, introducing yourself, making that sort of personal connection, eye contact, letting them know that everything's confidential. I think I have that noted elsewhere. And so you can kind of make that connection and establish that trust with people. Especially for paralegals, you're going to be the ones that are first starting to fill out that N400 form with people and starting to ask those really somewhat invasive questions that are on that form. So make sure that you take the time at the beginning to introduce yourself, kind of let them know what you're doing. I'm going to be going through this form with you. I'm asking the questions on the form. If you don't understand something, let me know. All of that kind of, human connection etiquette stuff. You do have to go through every question on the application form and even on the intake form, which we'll talk about. Some of the questions seem a little bit repetitive, but They're the questions that the US government has determined are required to be asked of everyone who wants to naturalize. And so we do have to make sure that we're asking every single one, we're not skipping the questions, and that you ask questions kind of multiple ways. As we get into the form, you'll see that some of them are pretty complicated. A note that, if people come in with their family, unless a family member is absolutely necessary for translation, because we don't have an interpreter that speaks their specific language, we do try to have family members wait in a separate area so that they're not with you as you're working with the person filling out the form, just because, again, these are invasive questions, and there may be some things that people are less inclined to share if their child is with them, or their spouse, or their aunt, or something like that. So help us kind of do that, and then if you feel like there's a red flag, like someone seems hesitant to share something, you can track down your site lead person or your One America staff person and let us know so we can address it. Along with that, just kind of trust your instincts. If you're in doubt about an answer to a question, or you have questions, flag it for the attorney. We'll be talking about what we mean by that and how to do that. So a little bit about how the day will go as people come in. So there's slide number 7. Thank you, Greg. Yes, folks on the phone, we're on slide 7. There are 6 basic stations or areas at the site, and there are volunteers stationed all along the way. The intake station is where folks first get signed in order. They also get that yellow intake form that you all have. And so starting with the second page of that, there's information for the client to actually fill out. That gives us their basic demographic information, some information about, do they meet the general eligibility requirements? Are there any red flags that we need to have an attorney look at right away? All of that kind of thing is what's covered there. So there will be volunteers stationed there both to help people sign in and also to sit with folks and help them fill out that form if they have any questions. The second station is forms preparation. That's where our paralegal volunteers are stationed. And so that's volunteers that are actually sitting with folks, starting that 21-page N400 form, filling it out with them prior to the attorney looking at it. The third station is the attorney or BIA accredited representative review. So every application will be actually reviewed by 2 attorneys. We do that for quality purposes, since we only get to see these clients one time. We don't have the fortune of being their representative over the course of several weeks or months. And so we want to make sure that 2 separate pairs of eyes are going on that application, just to make sure something doesn't get missed, or if the rapport was a little off with the first person, maybe there's something they'll disclose to the second person. So we emphasize to folks, sometimes they're confused about why they're waiting to see a second attorney, but it's really that second level attorney at the quality review station, station 4. They are always our more experienced volunteers that have done a lot of naturalization applications. They've also volunteered at Citizenship Day before, so they're really, really aware of the common issues that come up. And so it's extremely important that everybody does go through that quality review second attorney station. And then after they get through all of that, there's a copy station where we help them make copies of all their supporting documents and their applications. So there's one that they can send in and one that they can keep for themselves so they can study off of it and they know everything that they've sent into immigration. And then there's the exit station, which is a place where we can make sure they get connected to any resources they may need from here. For example, maybe they want to brush up on their English before they're tested on their English, or maybe they want to study the questions that they're going to be tested on. We give them all those lists of resources, connect them to local ESL classes, all that kind of stuff at that last station. And then there's a couple things that aren't listed on this general 6-station list. And one is the special attorney station. We have another station that not everyone has to go to, but we have at every site at least one, mostly 2 or 3, attorneys that are particularly experienced in the intersection of immigration law and criminal law, because it's an extremely complicated field of law, and things that are straightforward on one side are not straightforward when you come over to the immigration side. And so some people who have particular sorts of criminal issues in their background will need to wait through another station to see those special attorneys to make sure that they're not putting themselves at risk of potentially deportation or other immigration consequences by applying for citizenship. So we have the special attorney station. We use the language special because we don't want to throw around the word criminal and be like, so-and-so needs to see the criminal attorney, because we don't want to do any sort of stigmatization. So we use that word special attorney instead. And then the other thing that's on here is that there is a flow manager at each of the sites, or two, depending on the size of the sites. Those are going to be your One America staff people, and they will be checking that every client goes through the stations in order. They'll be the ones who send people to the special attorney station if it's needed, and they'll be kind of keeping track of how people are going throughout the day so that we make sure that nobody gets missed, nobody's waiting longer than someone else because even though they came in first, all of that kind of stuff, because it can be pretty hectic. So between each station, the client's intake form needs to be checked by the flow manager. And so there'll be volunteers assigned to just help out the flow manager to kind of, since we can't be in all the places at once, to kind of come back and forth between us and the attorney room and us and the paralegal room, so we can look at the intake form and check and make sure everything's going smoothly. So a few important reminders I emphasized. So we're on slide 8 now. I emphasized the importance of the quality review station, that everyone sees at least 2 attorneys or accredited reps, and that you need to check in with the flow manager between each station. For English proficiency, as you'll see as we get into the requirements, people have to be able to speak and read and write a certain level of English to successfully naturalize, and so we will, as much as possible, try to have a designated paralegal volunteer working with the intake volunteers to screen people to make sure that they have at least a basic amount of English, or they qualify for an exception to that rule. And so we'll be training folks on how to do that. And then we do ask that everyone work with us to try to make sure that this happens. It's ultimately the responsibility of the flow manager. But if the client has any sort of criminal history, essentially anything above and beyond traffic violations, they need to go to the criminal or special attorney before they go to the paralegal, because we don't want someone to spend 45 minutes with you guys only to find out that they're not eligible to apply or proceed. The ideal is that everyone at the end of the event will get a completed and signed N400, which is a citizenship form, and a packet from the attorney that says what they need to do next, where they need to go next, or a slip, it's red, that indicates why they're not eligible to file, what maybe they're missing some documents, or maybe they need to wait a few years for more time to pass before between something in their past, or whatever other reason. The other thing I want to note is that on the front page of the intake form, which is listed as intake and screening form, we sent it out ahead of time and it's on the yellow form, there is a section for all of the volunteer stations to check off what they've done. So those of you who are volunteering in the paralegal, there's a checklist up towards the top that says paralegal forms completion, and there's some reminders there for like what you've done with the client, just to make sure that you've done all the things that you need to do as a paralegal, and kind of a reminder to you, okay, I really am done with this person. You do want to make sure that you write your name in that box and that you check all those boxes, because that's our only internal quality review for us to know what happened with the client throughout the day. If someone calls us a few days later and says, I came to Citizenship Day in Renton and someone told me this, and we don't know who talked to them, then it's a little bit harder for us to follow up as needed. So intake forms are super important, and we do have to collect every single one. So those of you working towards the end at the copy and the exit stations, you can help us make sure that nobody walks out with their yellow form too. So the slide number 9 just has sort of an example of what the checklists look like that I was just talking about. I know there's a lot of text on there. You don't need to read them all. You have them in front of you on the intake form. So slide 10 also has a lot of text on it that you don't necessarily need to read, but just to note that on the back side of that first page of the intake form, so I guess page 2, there is a legal agreement form, client agreement, that you as non-attorney volunteers are not responsible for signing. This is something that the attorneys will sign, but basically what it says is, 1, everything that you could tell us today is confidential, so know that our volunteers are signing confidentiality agreements, and it's okay to disclose things. 2, you understand that we're not going to be your representative throughout the entire naturalization process. We're giving you the best legal services we can today, but we're not going to continue to follow your case as it goes on. And 3, you understand that you have to provide truthful information, and that if you don't provide truthful information, it may result in negative consequences for you, because if you don't disclose something, we don't have all the information that we need to give you good advice. So it's something that when you're sitting down with your first client and you're looking at the intake form that they filled out for you, you can mention, hey, there's this form that you're gonna sign with the attorney. I'm not signing it with you, I'm not an attorney, but just be aware that you might want to read through it when you have some time when you're waiting. And then I did mention at the beginning that we'll be talking about fee waivers today. So in order to apply for citizenship, there's a $680 fee charged by US Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is one of those big barriers that I was just talking about that prevents people from naturalizing. We've been telling people about this as much as possible on the phone. It's in all of our outreach materials, but when you're working with someone and filling out the form, you want to make sure you ask people if they know about the fee. And a lot of times they'll be like, yeah, I know, I'm going to pay it or save up to pay it. Or if they say that they want to apply for a fee waiver. And so people who receive public benefits or have income at or below 150% of the federal poverty level, which I think I'll be going over more details later, can qualify to essentially have that fee waived. It's not a guarantee, but they can fill out a separate application asking USCIS to waive that fee. And then we'll be having some of our more experienced paralegals actually helping people fill out that form, but I'll go over it a little bit later today. But you just want to ask, like, are you trying to apply for a fee waiver? If so, do you have proof of your income or proof that you receive public benefits? And then for folks that maybe their income's just above that a little bit, and they don't qualify for fee waivers, but the fee is still an issue, another option is taking out a special citizenship loan. There's not a lot of banks that offer this, but there are credit unions both in Western Washington and in Eastern Washington that are offering now special citizenship loans, which are pretty low interest rate loans. So instead of having to pay $680 all up front, they can pay $70 a month for a year or something like that, or 10 months. So there's a few different credit unions listed on the slide here. I'm on slide number 12. There's a few different credit numbers listed on here, and there's information at the different sites. There'll be information, and a couple actually of the Eastern Washington sites will have representatives from the credit unions there. If people have questions, they can ask right away. All right, slide number 13, just a few notes about working with interpreters. Some of you are here at the training because you're signed up as an interpreter volunteer. Others of you will be working with interpreters. We love our interpreters. Our interpreters make this possible for us to actually communicate with a lot of the folks we're dealing with. And so just a few things. You want to make sure that when you're sitting down and you're working with a client who has an interpreter, you explain that both you and the interpreter are bound by confidentiality, and then the interpreter can translate that. And then the interpreters, we want to make sure that you know that we ask you to do word for word translation. Don't change what things are being said. Do translate word for word, and translate slowly, and give breaks when you're talking to your clients, or when you're when the client's talking to you, you might need to remind them sometimes to take a minute and let the interpreter translate. And then interpreting is hard work, so if you are sitting down with an interpreter and it looks like they're about to fall over, make sure to give them a break, get them some water, find another interpreter. All of our sites have a lot of interpreters, so hopefully people will have enough time to take a break between clients, especially with this application form that's 21 pages. It's like an hour of translating maybe, and that's a lot of talking, so we want to make sure we give people breaks. And if you are an interpreter and you need a break, take a break. Let us know that you need one if we try to give you another person. Another note for interpreters on slide 14, the new version of the N400, which we'll be using, it came out in the spring of this year, has a particular interpreter statement. There's a section that, it's page 19 to 20 of the N400 if you want to look at it. If you're an interpreter, be sure to read this before you go to volunteer at your site. And so applicants who use an interpreter because they qualify for one of the waivers to the English requirements, they have to sign saying, everything on this form was translated to me in my language, and I'm fluent in X language. And then the interpreters also have to sign and say, I'm fluent in X language, and I translated every single word on this document.
Is there some sort of qualification to be an interpreter, or are you just fluent in another language and you can be an
We don't require that you be a certified interpreter, we just require, fluency. Yeah, good question.
But there are some words, if you're going to be an interpreter, there are some words that you'll have wanted to read through the entire form to be sure you understand what those words are, because those are some odd words.
And we do have the translated version of the application form into like 3 or 4 different languages. So even if you are fluent in different languages, maybe you don't know the word for militia or guerrilla group or all these other things that are distinguished. And so definitely if you're volunteering in the interpreter role, make sure you've read through the entire application form before the event and that you've kind of figured out how you would say all the different words on there. All right, turning it over to Greg Rogers, our attorney trainer for a bit, and I'll be back with you in a minute.
Great. Thanks, Lily. My name's Greg. Good to see a nice group here, and welcome to all of you on the telephone. I want to thank you personally for your agreement to do this. It's a really important event, and for those of you who have never done it before, you'll realize how important it is. You'll see the feeling, the emotion in people's faces when you help them through this process. When they bring their families, they're all dressed up. This is a big, important day for a lot of people. I'd like to get a sense in the room here. How many people have actually done this before? Just one of you. So most of you are new. So to you who've done it before, thanks a lot. You know what it's like when we talked about that this is a long day. There's a lot of stuff going on.
Oh, I haven't done the Citizenship thing. I've done that for.
You've done naturalizations before. So if you've done naturalization applications before, but you haven't done Citizenship Day, it's a different experience because as lawyers who are used to being in our offices doing these things and completing things and knowing in advance the client we're going to see and the information about them, to suddenly being presented, here's a person, you've got about 45 minutes with them and then they're going to be gone. And there's going to be an application filed based on what you gave them. That's a kind of a scary prospect as a lawyer, and so you really want to be sure that you do everything right. So again, I appreciate what you've done. I'm going to emphasize the importance of the checklist. The checklists are really, really, really important because again, for any of you who have done work like this before, you know the importance of it. You get to see it, you get to work with it, you have days and days, maybe weeks even to deal with the form. Here, it's one time and they're gone. And so the only chance to be sure you've really done it right is through the tried and tested approach that we've used, which is these checklists. So always be sure to fill out the checklist and do those as well. So let's talk about the basic elements. What does it take to become a citizen, to apply for citizenship in the United States? You'll see in the form as you go through it with Lily and me later on, but it's basically these issues. The person has to be at least 18 years old. You can't just apply for citizenship without already being 18. You'll hear later on that some people who are under 18, when their parents become citizens, they just become citizens as a part of that process. But you can't go through this naturalization process unless you're already 18 years old. You have to meet certain residency requirements, and by the way, I'm on slide 15 for people who are on the telephone. And the residency requirements talk about how long you have to have been a permanent resident, and you have to meet physical presence requirements. So not only how long you've been a permanent resident, but how long you've actually physically been in the United States as a part of the process. One of the most complicated ones is the next one, good moral character. The government gives a very long series of things that include good moral character, and they're not all that specific, and so it's a big judgmental issue in terms of looking at the law, looking at the regulations, and understanding the rules. Lots and lots of the questions deal with good moral character things. They have to, as Lily talked about, they need to speak, read, and write English, although there are some exceptions. We'll talk about that briefly. Knowledge of US history and civics, and willingness to take the oath of allegiance. I always think it's interesting when you look at all of this. A lot of times people talk to me, they say, oh, you do immigration work, and then people, to be citizens, they should do more. I said, well, they've got quite a bit. And frankly, as most US citizens, if you took the test, you might not pass that test that these people have to pass. You've got a question.
Are there exceptions for knowledge of US history and civics for people who didn't do formal education?
There is a disability waiver, but just formal education is not a basis for waiving that knowledge. And so some people, and that's one of the big impediments. A lot of people are very concerned. I just don't feel I know enough about this to apply. But one of the things that we have as part of the program here is all sorts of information about where you can take citizenship training days, programs, information listed in English and a variety of other languages. The US government puts out all the questions, all the answers, and in multiple languages, so you can see it that way. Some people say, yes, but I can't read, and so there's all sorts of issues. And we'll talk about disability waivers in a little bit, okay.
Can I just
Yes,
add
another
that I'm
question.
from Rutten Tech?
Yes.
I'm the citizenship person there.
Okay.
And if people are in that position, there are citizenship classes. The libraries offer, there's a lot of ESL citizenship classes specifically for people to help them through that. So that's another resource that we could point people in.
So
Yeah.
for people who might not have heard it, it was just a discussion about there are lots of resources. This is really, and Lily mentioned this before, this is an incredible program started here in Washington State, used as a model on a national basis that's done around the country now, and we're the one that still does it. So it's a pretty important project that you're working on, and thanks to all the different training programs that help people qualify for this. Let's look at the next slide, number 16. What's that residence requirement that I was talking about? A person has to have been a lawful permanent resident. We lawyers call them LPRs. Everybody else says green card holder. Okay, and green cards are actually, you'll see them in a minute, that are actually green again. They used to not be. But a person has to have been a permanent resident for at least 5 years. It's the standard rule. There's also an exception though. A person can apply after 3 years if they've been a permanent resident for those 3 years, and for those 3 years they've been married to a US citizen. So those two things combined allow you to maybe apply for 3 years. I always think of it this way. The government basically says if you've been a permanent resident for 5 years, you probably had enough chance to really understand US culture and issues. That's okay to apply to become a citizen. If you're a permanent resident living with a US citizen, you not only go out to whatever you do during the daytime, but you come home and you're still living a US citizen type life. You're living with a US citizen, maybe not your foreign-born permanent resident spouse or a family. And so it's perhaps a chance to learn it and get it indoctrinated faster into the US culture. So residence has to be continuous. Some people think, well, do I have to live here for a full 5 years every day, all day? No, but continuous presence does allow absences, but the longer they get, the more potentially of concern they are, and we'll talk about those briefly in terms of how long that absence can be. And if they're gone for a certain amount of time, they might break this continuity of residence for the 5-year window or the 3-year window. They might still be permanent residents, but they might have to wait till they've gained that amount of time back before they apply again. Some people who are gone too long might actually lose their permanent resident status, and so it's a really critical issue to understand exactly how long they've been gone at any one time. And that's part of the questions that they provide answers for 5 years at least. That they have to have also resided for 3 months in the district in which they're applying for naturalization. So basically for people who are coming in here, they have to have lived in this in Western Washington area basically for at least 3 months. There was a kind of an odd exception that makes it not so important, but it is 3 months living here. You also have to live in the United States from the time you file for citizenship to the time you're interviewed and sworn in. Now that doesn't mean you can't leave. Again, you can still leave on occasional trips, short trips here and there, but you can't be gone for such a great time that you break that continuity of residence again. So trips to see family and friends outside the United States, even a several week-long trip, even a month or so trip, that can be acceptable. But a super long trip, it's not a good idea to file yet. Make sure they're going to be here for the time between the date they file and the date they're interviewed. It generally takes about 5 months between the date you file here in Western Washington and the date you're actually interviewed. That gives you a sense of how long it's going to be.
And for folks that are volunteering in Eastern Washington sites, it's been a little faster at the Yakima Service Center, 4 months or so.
They used to
But
actually,
it really varies.
and in other parts of the country, much longer, in some occasions. They generally don't do interviews quicker than 3 months after the date of filing. They did at one point. They kind of got up to speed really well. The problem was people who were applying, who applied with an exception that says you can apply, this is the last bullet point, 3 months before your residence period is met. So some people might say, well, I haven't resided in this district for 3 months yet, or maybe I haven't fulfilled quite the 5 years, so I'm applying a few months ahead of the 5 years. And then they set the interview and the person still hadn't met the 5 years. And so the government said, we've got to wait, we're going to hold off, and generally 4 months is about the fastest you're going to get an interview. I want to point out this 3-month issue. It's really important. If you're talking to a person who says, well, I'm going to use the 3-year issue. I'm married to a US citizen. I've been a permanent resident for 3 years as well. I'm going to apply 3 months before I reach that. That's a dangerous issue. You have to have been married for the full 3 years to a person who's been a US citizen for the full 3 years before you apply. You can't apply 3 months before that, all right? So, but you can before you meet the 5 years residence. All right, we're going to go to the next slide, number 17. This is, actually it is a color slide. It's a little bit harder to see here. The bottom one is the current green card. And if you look at the top one, it's kind of whitish, pink and blue. So people come to and say, why do they call it a green card? They actually used to be green pieces of cardboard, basically, a paper card. And they just cut the name, and now the government's going back to doing them as green cards. They're green, and they have a huge magnetic strip on the back of them with all sorts of information in there. I understand it's like 32 layers of technology in there. Green cards are valid for a 10-year period of time, and then people have to get new ones, and that's when they build in new fraud protection devices into them. That's why people have to get green cards every 10 years, basically.
Can I just make a note on that green card note? So most of the ones you'll see look like that one on the bottom, but we do serve people, especially out in Eastern Washington, we serve people who've had their green cards for sometimes 20 or 30 years, and so they have some of the older looking ones, and those ones also have different expiration rules. Some of them have ones that don't expire, so it's a whole thing. You don't need to know all the details, but we just wanted you to be familiar with all the different ones, what they look like.
And they're basically credit card sized documents. So. All right, slide number 18. I talked to you about two different kinds of issues of residence. There has to be this issue of physical presence as well. So for the person who uses the 5-year standard, they have to have been in the United States for 18 months of the 5 years at least, and for 30 months for the 5 years at least. And for people who are using the 3-year standard, they have to have been in the United States for at least 18 months. So you add all that up. If a person hasn't been in the United States with their various trips that they've been out to meet that amount of time, it's not time for them to apply. They need to be here for a little bit longer before they do the application. I'm going to go to slide number 19. All right, good moral character. This is where we are not asking you to be the judge. We just spent yesterday, we were doing some training of attorneys, and there's a lot of issues going on in this good moral character things. Let me just mention a few of them. There are things called mandatory bars. If you have one of these things, there's like the mandatory bar number A, conviction of any aggravated felony after November 29, 1990. If that person has that, that's permanent bar mandatory for that person to be able to apply for citizenship. Can't do it. One thing I noticed isn't here is the murder. We have to make sure the murder. If a person's been convicted of murder, they can't apply for citizenship. They just don't qualify as being a person of good moral character. So that's the second one. Permanently, anytime, if you ever had it done, you're not going to be able to apply for citizenship. And then there are some other ones that are also bars. The government cannot consider you a person of good moral character if you've had one of these things under number B, but only if those have occurred within that window of time, the 3-year or the 5-year window that I talked about. If they've occurred outside that time, they might be considered, but they're not a mandatory bar to showing your good moral character. So things like conviction or admission of what's a CIMT, crime involving moral turpitude. Okay, so I've just gone through good moral character. What does that mean? And that's got its own kind of complications. And then crime involving moral turpitude has its own series of issues that we have to start analyzing to figure out, does it actually meet that standard or not? If a person's committed 2 or more offenses, this is the criminal issues, and the aggregate sentence they've had has been 5 or more years, there's an issue there that they're going to be barred if that occurred during the crime, the event, during that 3 or 5 year window of time. Controlled substance violations, big issue right now with marijuana being legal in certain issues in the state of Washington. Permanent residents are still subject to the federal laws, and controlled substance violations are still an issue. Yes, we have a question.
So this is if they get caught.
Well, it's an interesting thing. There is a question that says, have you ever committed a crime for which you have not been apprehended, arrested,
I read
or
that
detained?
question.
Yeah, and so honesty, as a lawyer and as paralegals, we always have to tell people, you need to be honest when you complete the forms with the federal government.
Yeah.
Honestly, as a lawyer, I have no idea why the government asked a question like that. I think it's the strangest question in the world, probably. But it is a real question on the form, and a person has to answer honestly.
Well, what if the guy's like, well, yeah, I smoke weed from time to time.
Okay.
Is that a yes?
So we would have to probably talk to a lawyer more specifically about that issue, especially for permanent residents. US citizens, Washingtonians who are citizens, don't have to worry about that.
Don't.
But a permanent resident, I will tell you that at the border right now, some of the border officers are asking questions about use of marijuana, and they're actually preventing people from coming into the United States, even those people said I've done this legally in Washington under the Washington law. Immigration is a federal standard, and they said, yeah, but we don't enforce Washington law, we enforce the federal law. So it's a more complicated question, yeah, it creates some challenges. What are some of these other things? Conviction, which is 180 days or more of jail time. False testimony to gain an immigration benefit, where they're actually talking with an immigration officer, and they give something where they get a benefit out of that from having given false testimony. There's a separate concept for just lying to an immigration officer, but this one is an important one that prevents you from qualifying for good moral character. We talk about prostitution or commercialized vice. We'll skip over that one generally. Alien smuggling, I want to point out, alien smuggling is important when you see people who have families. Alien smuggling can be, I'm driving into the United States across from the Canadian border, and I've got my non-citizen partner, spouse, whatever with me, and I lie to help that person get into the country, or I help them get into the country without providing their immigration documentation. The government says that's alien smuggling, and that's an issue of concern to be thoughtful about when you're talking with people. Polygamy, habitual drunkard, this is not just being an alcoholic or occasionally being drunk, this is kind of its own definition of that. And illegal gambling, these are all reasons for, if they occurred within the 3 or 5 year window of time that you're using, that person cannot be considered a person of good moral character. So let me just give you a quick understanding then. Why do you keep mentioning this 3 or 5 year issue of time? What if a person you're talking to has one of these issues that occurred 4 years ago, and they've been a permanent resident for 7 years? And for 3 of the years that they were a permanent resident, they were married to a US citizen. That person could choose to apply under the 3 year window because the crime, the issue that occurred, that's a reason for not being considered a person of good moral character, occurred outside that 3 year window. So it can be a really wise thing. A person might say, well, I don't know what to do, I'll just use the 5, I've been a permanent resident for 7 years. No, that person wants to use the 3 year window of time because you can push that mandatory bar out of the issue. Yes, another
So if
question?
they're eligible for the 3, would you always recommend going for the 3?
The question is, if they're eligible for the 3, would you always go for the 3? Not always. Some of the reasons why I don't always go for it is, with the 3, you have to prove marriage, things like that. So there's a little bit of extra or different documentation. I actually talked with a client on late last week, and he qualified for both of them, and we just decided to go for the 5 just because it was a little bit easier. He already had the document ready. Yeah?
If they committed any of these things,
Yes.
say years before they apply, do they not risk, they're guaranteed that they're not going to lose their green card, or is it a risk?
So if any of these events that we've just talked about, aside from murder or aggravated
Right.
felony, and they occurred outside that window of time,
Yeah.
does that guarantee that they will become a permanent resident, or citizen, perhaps?
Yes, or they will not lose their.
I think probably the answer is more, it doesn't guarantee that they will, because it's something that might be considered, but
In and of itself.
thank you very much, not in and of itself, in and of itself, it can't be considered a mandatory bar.
Okay.
Right,
Also,
so-
but on the question about will they lose their green
Oh,
card
there's
status?
another, okay, thanks, yeah.
So that's a good question, and some of these things, we're not gonna go into detail, that's why we have our attorneys. But some of these things are A, a bar of good moral character, and B, also a ground of inadmissibility or deportability. And so that would mean that by applying, they could, by sharing this information that there was this thing that occurred, even if it was outside of this 3 or 5 year window, that's a chance for immigration to look at their case and say, oh, you know what, you're actually removable. And so, yes, there is a risk.
That's important.
Yeah.
So it's a very important, so when you see these things, they're always, we use the term red flags, they're always things that kind of, oh, there's something here. This something here may actually hit 2 or 3 different kinds of issues that we're concerned about. I talked to a guy last night at the King County Legal Clinic who did not have one of these issues that was a mandatory bar, and yet the issue that he presented to me, it would probably subject him to being deported. So, and that's one of the things we don't want to do. We don't want to tell a person, you're a green card holder now, and you've been one, and you'll probably be able to keep renewing it over and over again if you file for the renewal every 10 years. But if you apply for naturalization, you're pointing yourself out to the government, and you might get deported, and that's way worse. So we just don't want to do that. All right, I'm going to move on because I know Lily's going, I've got a lot to talk about. All right, good moral character. Then there are some discretionary bars, not just the mandatory ones, but discretionary. If they occur within, again, a 3 or 5 year window of time, you have to submit good moral character issues to show, hey, I am a good person, even though you might have these other issues, and they can consider there's other crimes, there's incorrect or false information. That's not just the testimony that I was talking about before where you got a benefit, but just having still lied to an immigration officer. Failure to pay child support can be a big issue. And there's questions about, do you have children? Are you divorced? Things like that. The government can gather that up and understand these issues. Tax violations I mentioned. Voting. Lily told you, you can't vote unless you're a citizen, so if someone tells you they voted, there's an issue there. So we got to figure out what was the basis of it, and is there a reason that we can maybe say this is not a problem, but it has to be explained. Failure to register for selective service. Men between the ages of 18 and 25 who are permanent residents have to register for selective service. And even if they came in illegally, they have to register for selective service, which sounds kind of strange. But so a lot of times people just simply don't realize it. Their parents became parents became permanent residents years ago. They just kind of thought, well, I never heard about this, they didn't register, and now they're in front of you and they've never registered. So we have procedures and forms to be able to provide to the government to show maybe the person didn't know that they had to register and didn't willfully fail to register. And so if these are new issues, or maybe they're 35 or 40 or 50 years old, well, I didn't register and I can't register now. There's all sorts of things that we can do to help them out through that process. Other unlawful acts, and extramarital affairs, there's all sorts of different reasons that are discretionary, especially if they occurred within the 3 to 5 year window. All right, English language ability. This is an issue that's determined at the time of the interview, so if you're talking to a person at the time of the Citizenship Day and if they express concern to you about this, this is another thing where the classes that are available all throughout the state are really important to help that person learn to be able to speak English well. The issue is determined at the interview, so remember, it's maybe 4 or 5 months from now, the person has an opportunity to get that basic understanding. And we'll talk about the questions that they're asked about in a little bit. Well, right now, they're only going to be asked to read and write 1 to 2 very, very basic sentences. It's an easy thing, but they're just very basic sentences. They're part of normal communication, not nearly the level of detail and complexity that we're talking about here today. It's about 4th grade level. Although I think, as Lily pointed out yesterday, this form itself is way beyond 4th grade level that they're asked to complete. There are exemptions to the English ability. I think I had that question earlier. So if a person is greater than or is 50 years or older at the time they file, on the date they submit that application, they have to already meet the standard. 50 years or older and at least 20 years as a lawful permanent resident, they're still going to have to take a test, but the history and civics is in the test in the language of their choosing. So they can bring an interpreter, they can have that done, and they can get those questions and answers in their own language. If a person's 55 years or older and they've been a permanent resident for 15 years or more, they also can indicate that on the form when they file, and they can get the test in the language of their choice. There's also a disability waiver. That was a question as well. Now, the disability waiver is the thing that we're not doctors, you're not doctors. This is a person who actually has to get a physician or a doctor of osteopathy, or I think a psychiatrist can work. And they have to say that this person cannot become capable of doing these things. Not just they don't want to, I feel too old to do it, but you're not capable of doing it. It's a waiver that's available for a person. But that is a big reason why a lot of people don't want to do this, and you can encourage them if there's opportunities to learn more. We're on slide number 22 now. So the history and civics one, I really encourage you to go online. Do we have all the questions here? I don't think we have them
They will
here.
be at the sites.
Go online, take a look at the questions and the answers. They're all there for everybody to see. They have all sorts of ways to study these with flashcards, and they have them in your own language, so you can kind of learn what it is. But again, you can, especially for people who can take the language in their own, the test in their own language. When they are sitting down at the table with the officer who's asking the questions, on the officer's screen, 10 questions will come up. The officer doesn't get to choose which 10 questions to be able to ask. The person has to be able to answer 6 out of the 10 questions correctly. If they answer the first 6 questions correctly, they're done. they've passed the examination, and they don't have any further issue about the history or civics. But they get to have several that they fail. If they do fail this, they're given the opportunity to apply again or have the exam done again about 3 or 4 months later, I think is what people generally do. 100 questions are there, 100 answers are there. Again, we talked about English exemption, but you still have to pass the test in your native language. Now, on the history exemption, for a person, here's another exception here. If you're 65 years or older at the time you file, and you've been a permanent resident at least 20 years, you don't have to look at a whole 100 questions. The government actually says, here are 20 questions. We'll ask you as many as 10 out of those 20. So there's only 20 questions that they have to study for instead of 100. Yes, a question.
The 20 is published.
Yes, absolutely. It's published, and there's an indication on the questions, this is one of the 20 questions. So they know exactly which ones they'll be able to do. So it makes it a little less daunting for them to be able to study for. And again, we have the disability waiver that's going to be at site, so people can take that and use that as well. All right, slide number 23. We most certainly will encounter people during the course of the program who we're going to say, you should not apply for citizenship because you might be deported as a result of this, or all sorts of issues there. It's one thing to just not get citizenship and still remain a permanent resident, but to be deported as a result of filing is a really dangerous issue. So if the person's committed an aggravated felony, this is something we're going to deal with. Aggravated felony is not what you normal people think of as aggravated felony. It's a very specialized immigration definition, so the lawyers will be working on that one. If they've actually given a false claim to US citizenship in front of an immigration officer to get a benefit, that's a big issue. As one example, I had a client one time who the officer said when he came through the border, he told me he was a citizen. And we were able to show he didn't say that, but that's an issue to be concerned about. False or misleading information to the government, again, crimes involving moral turpitude within the 5 years of, it says admission in quotes, and admissions in quotes is an issue because for a while there was a concern that when a person became a permanent resident, that would be the issue, I think it was, and the government says that's not an admission for a good time. Unlawful voting, again, not always an issue, but you have to have a lawyer make sure they're looking at that. And then if they unlawfully obtain a green card, the government is not going to give citizenship to a person who should never become a permanent resident. So they're going to watch for that as well. All right, important thing to think about is that there's a Child Citizenship Act. So if you're dealing with people who have families, rather than paying the $600 some for each application for every family member, if a kid qualifies for this, they become a citizen when one of their parents becomes a citizen. So we're always on the watch for this. Children automatically become citizens. This is slide number 24. If their child is under 18, at least one of the parents naturalizes. If the child is residing in physical and legal custody, and the child is to have to be a permanent resident to get that citizenship. So really helpful thing that can pull the rest of the family through and save them a lot of expenses. I think is this where you wanted to go, or where do you want to go? Yep. Yes? No? I can
Yeah,
do this
I'll
one.
jump in.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Cool. So thanks, Greg. And Greg's going to stay here so that if questions come up as I go through the rest of the training that are legal specific, he can pipe in. So just a quick note here. A completed N400 application, which is the thing we're going to dive into for the second half of the training now, consists of the fully completed form, 2 passport-style photos, which we give information to folks about at the site, a check or money order for $680 or a fee waiver request, a copy of both sides of the green card, and then any other supporting documents needed in that specific case. And then we tell folks to send it by certified mail, return receipt requested, and keep a copy. And those folks volunteering at the copy station, you'll be helping folks with all of that. We have it all ready for them, envelopes, pre-addressed, everything like that. So a quick note, for the rest of the training, we'll be covering in depth how to fill out the N400 form. I strongly encourage everyone to stay, but it's actually only mandatory that you stay if you're volunteering in the paralegal role at this point. So if you are on the phone and you're volunteering in any other role, you can sign off if you need to, especially if you're interpreters though. I do encourage you to go ahead and stay so you get familiar with the form and what it says. But if you need to go, it's okay, and in the room too. Just make sure that if you're on the phone, you send an email to either Lily, whose contact information is at the end of the PowerPoint, or Sarah, who sent out the reminder about this training, letting us know that you attended so we could give you credit for that. So jumping straight into the paralegal specific training about filling out the N400 form. And again, sign up if you need to, but I encourage you to stay on if you can. So pull out your N400 form or pull it up on your computer if you're looking at it as a PDF so we can look at it together as we go through. One thing to note is that on every single page there's a box on the top right that says A number. That's a number that is listed on people's green card. And you need to write it on every single page, front and back. So some of you will be completing forms at sites where we're doing it by hand with pen and paper, and some of you will be at sites where we're doing it with computers, and so you're filling it out on Adobe and then saving it onto a USB flash drive afterwards so that the attorney can review it on their computer. But either way, make sure you put the A number on all the pages. If you're doing it by hand, it has to be in black ink or electronically, no blue ink. They don't like blue ink. And we recommend using all caps so that it's really easy to read. All right, so slide number 27. So begins the beginning of the N400, which is page 1, parts 1 and 2 of the form. The part 1, you're going to be talking about the eligibility based on your residence. So that 3 or 5 year window that Greg was talking about, you check that in 1 or 2 if you've either been a resident for 5 years or 3 years. And then part 2 is information about you. So people fill in their legal name, their name as it appears on the green card, and any other names that they have used. And sometimes those things don't match. Somebody has a driver's license that says one thing and that's their legal name, but the green card has an error on it or something like that, or vice versa. We've had all kinds of things like that. So just make sure you follow exactly what the form is asking you to do. Page 2, part 2, mostly pretty straightforward. It does ask people if they're interested in changing their name. They can change their name upon naturalizing if they want to, but it actually depends on, the reason it's on there is because in different districts the naturalization oath actually takes place in front of a judge who's also allowed to change people's names legally, but that doesn't happen here in Washington. So if people want to change their names, they can fill out the information here about what name they want to change it to, but they do still have to go through the entire name change process with the court as normal. So it doesn't automatically happen just by putting it on here. So if they're like, yeah, I do want to change it, just let them know, that's fine, we'll do it on here, but you also have to do the whole process as normal. Couple things to circle on here on slide number 28. Question 7 is the date you became a permanent resident. You just want to make sure that that date matches with what you selected on that first page about 5 or 3 years ago. Make sure that it's really 5 or 3 years ago or within that 90 days ahead of time rule if that applies. Number 10 deals with the disability waiver. It asks if your people are requesting an accommodation to the naturalization process. And if the answer to that question is yes, you're going to want to make sure that you flag down one of the flow manager folks, because that means the person needs a disability waiver, which is not something that we're qualified to do at Citizenship Day, so we want to get them hooked up with a referral to someone who can help them with that. Sorry, misspoke. Question 10 is about accommodations, which is different than the disability waiver. Accommodations to the naturalization process can be made. For example, if someone is deaf and can't hear the officer asking them questions, they can get they can get accommodations to that. They can have a sign language interpreter, or same thing if they're blind. If they need a wheelchair accessible facility, all that kind of thing, you want to make sure that you would note that down there on number 10. We don't get a lot of folks that have disabilities, but if there is somebody and you're not sure how to fill that out, you can ask for help. Number 11 is the one that deals with a disability waiver. You're saying, I can't fulfill the requirements of English or civics at all, and because I have dementia or Alzheimer's or something like that, then we want to refer them out to someone who can help them fill out that separate waiver form. And then question number 12 deals with the exemptions from the English test. So it asks if they fit any of those 50-20, 55-15, 65-20 rules that Greg mentioned. And if they do, go ahead and check yes to whichever of the ones that applies to them, so that they know when they go in for their interview, oh, this person's going to have the test in Spanish, or this person's only taking, getting the elderly version of the questions, so they only have to have questions from that list of 20. Moving on to slide 29, which talks about page 3 of the N400. It's pretty straightforward contact information. You want to make sure that you give good contact information. The current address, which is what you start with in part 4, question number 1, where have you lived during the last 5 years? You want to make sure people know that, USCIS will use the address to contact them. So if they move, if they're about to move, or they're going to, they need to make sure that they're updating their address with US Citizenship and Immigration Services, because any correspondence related to their application after they send it in will be sent to that address that's listed in number 1. Or the mailing address if you list a separate mailing address. The other thing that comes up when you start listing people's addresses is that continuous residence requirement, right? So if suddenly they're saying, oh, well, I lived outside of the country for an extended period, long enough to not actually have an address in the US, that's going to be something that you want to flag for the attorney. And I'll take a second to talk about what I mean by flagging for the attorney, because I'm going to be using that a lot of times. Basically, you'll have sticky notes. You'll have pens and paper and sticky notes, and we ask that you, if there's anything that you're not sure about, especially when you get to the questions about good moral character, anything that seems like it might address some of those grounds of deportation or anything like that. We're not expecting you guys to make those assessments. We're not expecting you to be experts in any of that. But anything that you have a question about, you just note down the question number, the page number, and if you're doing the application, on paper, you can just sticky note that actual page. If you're doing it electronically, just write it down on a sticky note, stick it on the front of that intake form, which will be going to the attorney, so that the attorney knows, okay, the application's complete, but the paralegal had questions about all of these things, so I'll make sure that I address all of these questions. So that would be something, if it seems like, oh, they didn't actually have an address here for a year, that would definitely be something that you want to flag for the attorney. Another thing to note is that it says if you need more space, use additional sheets of paper. There's only spots for about 4 addresses, so if people have moved around a lot in the last 5 years, it might not fit. We have pre-made, pre-formatted additional sheets of paper that have all the questions about the address. You just want to go to where your resources are on the site, pull out one of those forms and fill in the additional addresses. And then another thing to note is it goes in reverse order, so it asks for currently and then going back the 5 years. We've had people take all the time and fill it in the other way, and then they have to go back and fix it, and it takes a whole long time. So start with most recent and then go back in time until you reach the 5-year mark.
One of the questions we had yesterday in the lawyer thing, we talked about, travel. So, and we talked about 3 or 5 year window. Is a general recommendation still to do 5 years of addresses?
Yeah, so depending on the question is if you're applying based on the 3-year rule, do you have to do 3 years of addresses instead of 5? Our recommendation for Citizenship Day is go ahead and just put in the 5 years of addresses. And if you have a question, if you have somebody, unless you have somebody who maybe hasn't been here for 5 years because they're applying based on the 3-year rule, just do as much as you have. Slide 30 just shows the rest of the addresses on page 4, part 4, so we're going to just go through that real quick. Page 5, parts 5 and 6. So part 5 talks about information about your parents. So this gets to the issue that Greg mentioned about acquiring citizenship. When someone's parent naturalizes, they may automatically become a citizen. So we actually, every Citizenship Day, we get people who are citizens and don't know it. Because they didn't know that this applied to them. Also, depending on when they were born and where they were born and what the status of their parents were and where the parents were born, it's even more complicated than that. It may be that they can acquire citizenship through grandparents or things like that. So, but these questions here, you just want to ask, if you have someone whose mother or father is a U.S. citizen, that's a flag to the attorney too, because they're not going to want to, they can't file, they're already citizens. Part 6, information for criminal records check. Pretty straightforward. You just have to ask people these questions and put them in. And this is a reminder to folks that USCIS will be running a background check on them. And so people may be disinclined to share certain information with us about arrest history if they don't think it's relevant. So you can say, they're going to run a background check on you, and for that reason they need this information. And that's why it's also really important that when you talk to the attorney and when you talk to me, you share everything that's relevant, everything that we're asking you. Another quick note is we work with a lot of Hispanic and Latino folks, and that's not one of the race options. They ask it's an ethnicity, but not a race. So that's always a question when I'm working with people, and I just say, I'm sorry, you just have to pick one. Just it's not my decision, and it's annoying, and we recognize that. All right, so slide 32, page 6, part 7 of the N400 talks about employment and schools they've attended. People have to disclose everywhere that they've worked or attended school within the last 5 years. And so, fill out every piece of information there. There's some instructions in there about what you're supposed to do if people are self-employed or unemployed. And you just have to basically account for all of the time in the last 5 years. So if somebody was unemployed for a couple years within that, you want to do where they're working now, the time that they were unemployed is a separate section, and then the time where they worked before that, basically. And then I'm going to spend a little bit more time on slide 33 talking about page 7, part 8 of the N400. This is travel. So previously people had to disclose all travel since they became a legal permanent resident. On the new version of the form, it's only within the last 5 years, which is actually one of the only good changes about the form. There's a little less time. If people have been residents for 30 years, that's a lot of travel. So it asks people, how many total days did you spend outside the US during the last 5 years? How many trips of 24 hours or longer have you taken? And then list below all of the trips within the last 5 years outside of the country. So this is getting at that physical presence requirement. We'll have the math for you at the sites, but basically you essentially are making a list with people of every trip that they've taken within the last 5 years. And we have these calendars for 5 years of days where you can actually pull those out and count, like, okay, so you were gone for 6 days on this date, and 8 days on this date, and 7 days on this date, and 30 days on this date, and you add those all up, and then that goes in box question number 1. If you get to the point where that number of days equals close to half of the total number of days for the last 5 years or 3 years, depending on what they're applying for, and we have that math for you already figured out, then that's something you want to flag for the attorney, because they may be getting to the point where they haven't actually physically been present in the US long enough. The other thing you want to flag is if anyone has a trip that lasted 6 months or more. So that's one of the questions on here. That gets to the question of continuity of residence. Trips of 6 months or more may be assumed to break that continuity, and if they're not addressed correctly and shown that, oh, I did take a trip, but it was longer than I expected, and I didn't mean to leave the US, I kept my house here and my kids were still here, then they can usually still overcome that. But if they just have a trip for 6 months or more and it's not explained, that can be a risk. So you want to make sure you flag that.
And the time, the day you leave and the day you arrive are both considered days in the United States. All right, so that's the one easy thing.
Full 24 hours outside is what counts, yeah.
For the 24 hours or longer, we're so close to Canada.
Yeah.
So I mean, how do people remember how many times they've been for a weekend over Canada?
They have to do their best.
Yeah, it's really common for Canadians to, because even if they ask to have their passport stamped, the government won't do that. And so you just say, I'm sorry, but the government's asked, you've got to do everything you can to try to remember everything possible. And frequently what will happen is, the person will give you as much as they can, and then perhaps you'll write at some point, travel to Canada on average once every 2 months for 3 days at a time, something like that. Because the person's going to give their very best. Sometimes the Immigration Service might come back and ask, well, no, we really want every day. And you kind of say, I've given you the best information. That's usually not going to be a problem for a Canadian.
So in that case, I would say do the best you can to figure it out with the person, and then put a note for the attorney, and then the attorney can prepare that extra little note that says this is my average travel. We also have a number of pre-made sort of additional explanatory forms that for common situations, and that's one of them. That says, it's essentially a form they're adding on the form saying, I've listed all the travel that I can remember. I'm not 100% sure that's every single trip, but I do know I've never been out for more than 6 months, and I haven't been out for more than a total of X number of days. So we have that pre-made for folks too. Slide 34, so page 8, part 9 of the N400, talks about marital history. It's pretty straightforward. You go down the list, you answer all the questions. It does ask a lot of information about people's current spouses, if they've been married before, their previous spouses, and then their previous spouses' spouses. It gets a little bit crazy. So you just have to fill, we've told everyone that they're going to be asked this information, but you still end up with people who are like, I have no idea where my ex lives from now and from 20 years ago and all of that kind of stuff. So you just have to do your very best, and then if there's something that's missing, that's something that you can make a note of.
Just to
clarification on the definition of marriage.
Legally married,
Legally married and registered with the government as married to this person.
yes, legally married according to
Because
according to the rules of where you live.
Yeah, so the question was, what was legally married? So, I mean, so like, it's my understanding that in Idaho, you can have a common law marriage.
Which is if you just live with someone for X
For
amount of
whatever period of
years,
time.
you're married.
And in Canada, you're allowed Canadians say, well, like, I'm legally married if we live together, we file our taxes together for a certain number of years. That's a legal judgment, a legal decision, so you have to know what that is. You cannot, common law marriage is not legal in Washington, so a person might have been common law marriage recognized in Idaho, it would be recognized in Washington, but they couldn't do the same thing to become a common law marriage.
And then what about people who get gay married?
So that's completely legal now, depending on the state you're in, where the country you come from. And the really wonderful thing is, when the DOMA fell last year,
Right.
the US government just completely, from immigration standpoint, completely recognized it, and it's absolutely not an issue at all for anybody.
That's good to know.
So as long as their marriage was legal where it occurred, it's legally recognized in the United States.
So just a couple like notes to kind of be in the back of your mind as you're going through marital history. One is you want to make sure that it matches with what you've said. Like if they're applying for the 3-year rule, then you want to make sure that they actually are married and that the spouse's information goes in there. It does ask for number 5 on the on part 9 asks for, is your current spouse a U.S. citizen? So if it's a 3-year rule, that answer better be yes. And if your current spouse is a U.S. citizen, you have to give information about when they naturalized. So on slide 35, the continuation of this section talks about, did they become citizen at birth or did they naturalize? When was that? And then a question that comes up a lot is how to answer number 7. If your current spouse is not a U.S. citizen, complete the following information. Well, if they're a legal permanent resident, it's pretty easy. Put in country of citizenship and their A number, which is on the card, and check that they're a permanent resident. What if the spouse is undocumented? That's something that comes up. So our guidance to you is to fill it out as other and then write the word alien in there because that's true, but it doesn't necessarily signal to USCIS that this person doesn't have documents, right? We across the state or across the country, I've never heard of USCIS using that information to then like track down that person's spouse, even if you do write like undocumented in there. But we just want to say something true, but not specific there. And then you see it asks for, you know, if your current spouse has had more than one previous marriage, use additional sheets of paper to provide all this information about all these different previous marriages. Doesn't come up all that often, but if people have been married before, there's a lot of information that goes in on here. And if you don't know, you know, like the exact date of when the spouse naturalized, it's okay to say something like approximately 2007 or something like that. And if something's unknown, leave it blank and flag it for the attorney, and then they'll decide if they think it's important that the person fill it in before they file. Let's see. So slide 36, page 10, parts 9 and 10. There's the final part of the marriage question, and then there's children in part 10. And it's important that people know that they need to list the information about all of their children that's being asked here. Including children from previous marriages, children that may not live in this country, children that may be deceased, or stepchildren or adopted children, all of that counts. And so there's a lot of information. There's actually only room on the form to list, so you have to do the total number of children. There's only room on the form to list the information about up to 4 children. But that's one of the extra forms we pre-prepared because a lot of people have more than 4 children. So you can just pull out one of those extra forms and fill in all the information about additional children.
This is another one of those situations where the privacy, you realize the privacy and the importance of it because someone might be there with their spouse and they might have a child out of wedlock and that spouse doesn't know about it. And so this is an issue where you're asking questions that are really personal. And it's important that the person provide you accurate and truthful information, and it has to go on here. And so that's another reason why, you know, when you're talking with them, we keep the people separated.
Yeah, as much as possible. So there's a note on slide 37, we start talking about part 11 of the N400, which is the longest part. It starts on page 13 of the N400. And as you note, the answer, there are 53 questions in this section, and many of them have subparts. And this is where a lot of the good moral character stuff comes out. So the main thing that we ask for you guys to be aware of is You want to ask these questions slowly and multiple times. People get in kind of a pattern of saying, no. Have you ever been a terrorist? No. Have you ever gone to this place? No. Have you ever? But you want to make sure some of them are not the same as the one previously. So you need to make sure that they're really like listening and hearing and understanding each question. And you can give examples to make sure the applicant understands the question. I recommend that folks kind of give an introduction to this section and say, you know, this is, the rest of these questions may seem kind of intense and invasive, but that's just, these are the questions the US government has determined that we have to ask you. It's not that I think that you are a terrorist or I think that this or this or this. I have to ask you these questions and kind of just bear with me so that they feel comfortable talking with you. And then anything that you're in doubt about or not sure about or their answer seems weird about, these are the places where you're really going to want to flag things for attorneys. You don't need to make the determination about whether they have a crime involving moral turpitude within the last 5 years. You just need to know there's a crime, I don't know exactly what happened, please make sure that gets reviewed. So starting with page 13, part 11 on slide number 38, some of the questions like, have you ever claimed to be a US citizen? Have you ever voted or registered to vote? That gets at some of the questions that Greg was going over. The main thing to note is that there's a note at the top that says if you answer yes to any of these questions, include a written explanation on an additional sheet of paper and provide any evidence to support your answer. So that's a note for you guys. If there's a yes to any of these questions, you want to flag it for the attorney so they know how to handle it.
Before you go on for that one, just one point on number 9, that ever been a member of an association, organization, etc. One of the things we heard a while ago, a lot of times people just say no, I haven't. And a while ago, a few months ago, we started hearing issues that the Immigration Service was starting to take a little bit more focus on that, and just kind of basically saying, gosh, the person's 55 years old and they're applying for citizenship and they've never been a member of any organization, association, all go through those things. So generally for my clients, I encourage them to say, really, if you've been a member of anything, it's something you should, if you put at least one thing down, I think you're taking away or reducing the likelihood that there might be some concern expressed about that one.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think that's an interesting exception to the sort of if you answer yes to any questions, because you don't include an additional explanation if it's like, oh, I was a member of the church choir from this time to this time. There's a place on here to already explain that, so you don't have to add an extra sheet. But so yeah, I do the same thing. I say, actually, this is kind of a place where you can like talk about good things or things that you'd like to have done in the past, so you can put those on there. The one on here that isn't like yeah. All right, slide 39, page 14, part 11 is continued. These are where some of my favorite questions, like between March 23rd, 1993 and May 8th, 1945, did you work for or associate in any way with the Nazi government of Germany? I've never had anyone say yes to that. Maybe someday, but you know, it's getting more and more unlikely the older people get. But you do have to ask that question even if the person was not even born yet. Sorry, just work your way through them. As you see in question 14 and 15 for both paralegals and interpreters, that's some of the places where you want to be real careful about language because they talk about military unit, paramilitary unit, police unit, self-defense unit, vigilante unit. I speak a little bit of Spanish, but I don't know how to say the difference between all of those different things, right? And so you want to kind of look up that beforehand, be able to provide some explanations, like, you know, they do that on some of the questions, but just be aware there's multiple parts there, and people tend to just hear the end of a question, so you kind of want to make sure that you clarify with them every single part of the question so they know what they're answering. Again, any yes answer, big red flag. So slide 40, page 15, part 11 has a picture of that. This is a lot of the new questions from the new form about did you ever, you know, encourage people to become a child soldier or use weapons to hurt anyone or anything like that. Big red flag if there's a yes to any of these things. Question number 22 is that question we talked about earlier. Have you ever committed, assisted in committing, or attempted to commit a crime or offense for which you were not arrested? Ask the question. People usually answer no. If there's a question there, flag it for the attorney.
Important thing for number 17 and 18, these are points where if you didn't answer yes to the question above it.
Okay, so apologies, we had a little bit of technical difficulties. And so we're re-recording the last 15 or so minutes of the training for folks so that they can access it via video. So sorry about it cutting out, but I'm jumping right in where we cut off on the last video. So we are looking at slide 40 and talking about page 15, which is the continuation of part 11 of the N400. What Greg was saying is that with some of these questions, if you notice on questions 17 and 18, they start with if. So for the most part, you want to make sure that all of the questions on the application form have some sort of answer. In the case of those few questions, you want to leave it blank because you only need to answer those questions if the above answer was yes, as indicated on the form. So don't get in a pattern of just checking no, 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 no all the way down. You want to leave those blank, otherwise it doesn't look like you're paying attention to what the questions are. So just a reminder that if there are any yes questions on any of these lists, especially starting with question 22 and on about crimes, you want to make sure that you flag it for the attorney, as we talked about earlier in the training. A special note about question number 23, it says, have you ever been arrested, cited, or detained by any law enforcement officer for any reason? That's where the special attorney comes in, and we want to make sure that anyone who has a yes to that for anything above and beyond a speeding ticket sees that special attorney. But one note about that is that that the word cited does include traffic violations. So speeding tickets or driving without a seatbelt or something like that does mean that you have to answer that question as yes. And then if we move on to slide 41, there's a couple questions down where you explain why you marked yes to question number 23, where you fill out why you were cited within the little table under question number 29. And if you could click once more. So one more time. We've indicated here what it would look like if you were filling out the form for someone with a simple speeding violation. You can go ahead as paralegals and fill out the information there, why the citation occurred, where, or the date when it happened, where it happened, and then the outcome, which should say something along the lines of paid fine or paid fee and closed. You want to use the word closed. If it's nothing more than that, it's okay for you to go ahead and fill out that section, but you'll still want to go ahead and put a little sticky note on it for the attorneys so they can review it and make sure that you filled it out correctly. Anything above and beyond that, you actually kind of want to stop there, flag your go-to person for the room that you're in, and have them check to see if they need to see a special attorney. That's kind of a decision that we'll make on a case-by-case basis, but that's kind of a red flag for you to see, is it worth continuing the form or not. Starting with question 30, there's a lot of those questions around deportability and good moral character that we talked about earlier in the training. So again, any yes answer there, big red flag, make sure that you note it for the attorney. And we can move on to slide 42. All the way up to question number 36, if you'll click again. There are more questions that are going to be big red flags for the attorney. If any of them are yes, there are a lot of them around providing false testimony to immigration officers or false information to public officials. But question 37 and down quite a ways are questions around U.S. Armed Services. So answering yes to those aren't necessarily going to be problematic. They don't trigger any of the things that Greg talked about earlier, but just make sure you ask the questions as indicated. Don't answer the ones that start with if yes. And then a note about question number 46 that talks about selective service, the selective service requirement that Greg talked about. So you can actually on site there, if someone doesn't know if they registered, you can go use the computer that you'll have access to on site and go to sss.gov as listed on the slide and look someone up. It's really, really easy, and you can put in their registration number if indeed they did register. You can also register someone. If you're working with a male between the ages of 18 and 25 who hasn't registered, you can take them through the process of registering right then, print out the thing at the end that says confirmation and gives them their number, and then they're all set. If they have not registered, we have a pre-made form that they can fill out if the reason that they didn't register was just that they didn't know that they had to. As long as it wasn't willful, there's a pre-made sort of addendum form that they can use to explain that and sign it. So familiarize yourself with those extra pre-made forms ahead of time, and then you can help people do that, and then the attorney will look at it after you. And we can move on to the next slide, 43. So at the top of page 18, part 11, there's just some other notes about selective service. One of the notes is that if you are now 26 or older and you didn't register, it says that men are required to request and submit a letter confirming whether they registered or not from the selective service. It's called a status information letter. We've confirmed with USCIS that that's only required for people aged 26 to 31. So that means people for whom the failure to register occurred during the last 5 years, so within the statutory period. And we have information on how they can request that, and they can still go ahead and apply, and then they just have to request that letter and bring it with them to their interview. And then the final questions on page 18, part 11 are oath questions. So they ask if they're willing to support the Constitution of the U.S. and all the questions that people will be required to answer when they take the oath to actually become a U.S. citizen. So all of those questions should be yes. And then 53, they ask that people who have titles of nobility in other countries have to give that up upon becoming a citizen. We've never seen that before, and if you see it, please let one of us know so we can take a picture, because it would be very exciting. And then you finished, as far as paralegals go. You're done as of the end of part 11. You don't have the person sign the form in part 12, and if you move on to the next slide, there is a preparer's signature in part 13. That is something the attorney will sign, not paralegals. Next slide. A couple of notes about the fee waiver form. So like I mentioned earlier, we will be helping low-income people apply for to have the $680 fee waived. So when you're done working with a client with the N400, you want to ask them if they know about the $680 filing fee, or they want to see if they qualify for a fee waiver. Experienced paralegals will be the ones designated to actually fill out the fee waivers, so we'll let you know if you'll be asked to do that. And we only do fee waivers based on 2 out of the 3 eligibility options. Part A, which means that household receives means-tested benefits, so something where their income is taken into account, like food stamps. Or Part B, where their household income is under 150% of the federal poverty level, and we'll have charts so you can actually look at their income and see if that's true. We don't fill out forms, although people can be eligible for fee waivers based on a compelling financial need. That's really hard to prove, and it's not something that we're able to do at Citizenship Day, so only those first 2 things make someone eligible. We have a screening worksheet that you can use to fill it out to see if it looks like someone's eligible. If it does look like they're eligible, you'll either go ahead and fill out the form, or you'll move them on to a designated person to fill out the fee waiver form. Moving on to the next slide, you'll want to pull out your I-912 form to just take a look at it and familiarize yourself with what it looks like. It's a pretty straightforward form to fill out. If you're filling out the form based on Part A, which means the household receives a public benefit, then all you have to fill out is sections 1 through 3, which has demographic information about the person, section 4 and section 7, where they sign. You don't fill out anything else because that applies to other grounds of qualifications. Same with Part B. If it's the household income qualification, you fill out section 1 through 3, section 5, and section 7 only, just as it says on the form. And then you want to check off on the intake form that you've completed a fee waiver so that the attorney can take a look at it. If you have more questions about fee waivers, you can contact me or get a hold of your One America Flow Manager, but again, we'll mostly just have experienced folks filling those out. And go to the next slide. Just a quick note, this is Maria. She attended Citizenship Day last October and then naturalized in February. So although we just went through a lot of annoying legal information, lots of paperwork, just a reminder of why we're doing this, why we really appreciate you all as volunteers. We can't do Citizenship Day without our volunteers, so we really appreciate all the work that you do. Thanks for taking the time to view the training or to come to the training. Move on to the next slide and you'll see that all of our contact information is at the end of the PowerPoint, so you can contact us with any questions, and we look forward to working with you.